Hello, welcome to Politics on Pint. Thanks everyone for coming. This is our first Politics on Pint of the 2016-2017 school year, so we thank you all for being a part of it. We're so happy to have our special guest, Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon, everyone. I know. Now, throughout Politics on Pint, it's pretty casual. Feel free at any time to get up, grab some pizza, grab a drink, come back to your seats, ask questions. We're making this a discussion, nothing too formal here. It's going to be a lot of fun. And so I'll turn it over to our moderator, the wonderful Zach Acton, everyone.
Like you said, I'm Zach Eichten. I'm a junior here, and I'll shut up now and get to Mr. Steve Simon here. He's the one you guys want to talk to. So, Mr. Simon, welcome first off all to Brother Willie's Pub. And what we want to sort of start out with is, I'm sure most people here have heard of who John Kerry is, the Secretary of State at the national level. What is the difference between your job and his job, and sort of what does the Minnesota Secretary of State do?
Right. Well, definitely, I do not do what John Kerry does. It's a totally different kind of Secretary of State, as I'm sure most of you know. That Secretary of State is the nation's chief diplomat. I'm not. Secretary of State at the state level typically means a portfolio of duties, very much like the ones that I have. First and foremost, in my mind, and I think in most people's mind, is the duty of being the chief elections administrator in the state. So when I was campaigning for this job 2 years ago, 98% of the questions, comments, feedback, pushback, etc. that I would get was on that issue. It was on elections, was on democracy, was on voting, and that's what I think we're probably going to talk most about tonight. Because that's the area where the spotlight tends to find our office, not the other way around. Some of you know in recent history we had some big, giant recounts in Minnesota, like the 2008 Franken Coleman epic recount, and my predecessor in office was closely followed during that time for that reason. So elections is kind of the big one that most people think about, if and when they think about our office. But there's more. Actually, the majority of our workforce in our office, most people in our office do not work on elections. They instead work in the business services section of our office. So every business, virtually, in Minnesota, every business has to file certain stuff with our office, both at inception when they start the business and periodically thereafter, usually annually. And this can be all sorts of kind of commercial documents or documents about the entity or how they're structured, etc. And we do a lot of other, let's just say, commercial transactions through our office, kind of help the wheels of commerce keep turning. That's what employs the majority of the people in our office, not elections. But then we have other responsibilities, lesser known and lesser talked about, but nonetheless still very, very important. Let me give you one example of those other responsibilities, one that I'm particularly proud of that our office does. So we run something in our office called the Safe at Home program, Safe at Home. And the Safe at Home program is an address confidentiality program, or address anonymity program, you might say, for victims of domestic abuse, stalking, and other similar offenses. Basically what it means is someone enrolled in the Safe at Home program has their true physical address shielded. It is kept secret. It is kept confidential for all purposes, public and private. So we alone know where they truly physically reside, and so we handle things like their mail. We are, in essence, their mail carrier. So whether it's a magazine subscription or the cable bill or a personal letter or anything like that, we handle it so that no one can truly know where they physically reside unless they want someone to know. So that's something that I'm particularly proud of, and I worked on for a long time. Incidentally, just by way of background, so I was elected Secretary of State in 2014, but for 10 years before that, I was in the Minnesota legislature. So I represented my hometowns of Hopkins and St. Louis Park. Anyone here from Hopkins and St. Louis Park? All right. Yeah! Which one?
Hopkins!
You're a Royal?
Yeah.
Okay, so was I. So Hopkins High School, kudos. So I was there for 10 years. And then ran for this office when there was an opening in 2014. My predecessor, Mark Ritchie, who spent 8 years as Secretary of State, he didn't run again, and so I ran for this office. So I've always been involved in like elections issues and democracy issues and voting issues, and that really takes up a lot of time, especially now on this office. And if I may, just for a couple minutes, expand on that. So, I'd like to say, by virtue of all of that, that I'm in the democracy business in a lot of ways. And our office, the Office of Secretary of State, at its best, is about protecting and defending and strengthening the right to vote. And my personal mission in this office, as the person who happens to hold this office right now, my personal mission is very simple, super easy. You could fit it on a bumper sticker or a fortune cookie. My mission is to make it as easy as possible for all eligible Minnesotans to vote. Period. That's it. It's not complicated. And so as long as I hold this office, that's what I'm going to do. And I hope we'll get a chance tonight to talk about some of what that means. But let me just say this. Well, first, by way of, I don't want to hijack your interview, but let me just say that it really is a tremendous pleasure to be here. I love this school. I love being on this campus. First, it's a physically beautiful campus. I mean, the architecture and the landscaping. I mean, really, you're lucky to go here and St. Ben's. They're two just beautiful places to go to school. Secondly, I'm really an admirer of the work that is done by the McCarthy Center and is really kind of a beacon when it comes to civic responsibility and civic engagement, and that is really cool and really important. And I say I'm in the democracy business, and what an amazing time to be in the democracy business. We got 61 days left in what can only be described as an epic presidential election, right? I mean, you guys, I'm guessing, are between ages 17 and 18 on the young end to 22, 23, maybe 24 on the old end. I mean, you guys might live a very, very long time and never, ever again see a presidential election like this. This is not typical. So, and you know, that gets into issues too of turnout. And you might know this, you might not. Minnesota has a really, really good record of voter turnout. In fact, for 9 elections in a row, Minnesota was #1 in the country. 9 in a row. That is like a mind-blowing win streak. Think about that for a second. If you heard about an athlete who won 9 MVPs in a row, or an actor or actress who won 9 Oscars in a row, you would think that was totally amazing. But yes, Minnesota 9 in a row until last time, until 2014, the year I was elected to this office. In 2014, we fell off from our #1 ranking and we fell to #6. Still decent, still pretty darn good. If you're grading on a curve, 6 out of 50, not bad at all, right? But not up to our usual high Minnesota standards. So my goal this year, hopefully with your help, is to get us back to #1. That's where we belong. We owned that spot for many years, and I think we can do that. So I hope we get into some discussion of why that's the case. I will just say this, and maybe this will sort of tease some questions or comments from you. There are 2 schools of thought generally about turnout this election, nationally and in Minnesota, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about this. School of thought number 1 is that turnout will be depressed. And it'll be depressed, so the theory goes, because people don't like the candidates for president primarily, or they don't like the way the campaign is going, that it'll be ugly, and it'll be negative, and all the rest, so that this will actually depress turnout. School of thought number 2, and this is where I am, is that no, the opposite will be true, particularly in Minnesota. We can't speak for other states, but in Minnesota, turnout will be up even farther than it normally is in a presidential election year. And the reason is that, and let me put this very diplomatically and neutrally in a nonpartisan way, I think it's fair to say that these 2 major party nominees inspire strong feelings. How's that? Is that fair? I think they inspire strong feelings, and by that, and I mean it seriously, it's not a knock on either of them, because the strong feeling could be strong like or affection, or it could be the other. It could be strong dislike or worse. So, and my thinking is, having run for office myself and just been kind of a political junkie and election observer for a while, is that intensity drives turnout. Intense feeling one way or another about a person, a party, an issue, a candidate, whatever. When people shrug their shoulders and say candidate A, B, C, D, E, one's okay, one's not so okay, they may or may not turn out. But when they say, damn it, we've got to elect candidate A, or we have to make sure candidate B stays as far away from the Oval Office as possible, whether it's intense like or dislike, people show up. And my prediction, at least as of this point, what it feels to me like 61 days out, is people in Minnesota are going to show up. And I hope you're all going to be part of that, and I hope we can talk about some of that today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the introduction to yourself and the office. One thing that you mentioned during your introduction there was you're in the democracy business, and you're here to strengthen and sort of drive voter turnout. What are some of the initiatives that you've started to raise voter turnout in Minnesota?
So, I view the turnout calculation as kind of a two-pronged strategy. One way to get at turnout is through laws, right? Passing laws or talking about laws that are already on the books that have the tendency to encourage voting. What am I talking about? Well, here are the laws that we have on the books already. One of the major reasons that I think we are routinely number one in the country in voter turnout is that we have laws on the books, and have had in some cases for a long time, that do encourage and reward civic participation of all kinds. What do I mean? So for 40 years, for example, we've had a law on the books that says we have same day, or sometimes it's called election day, registration in Minnesota. Now, who here is a native Minnesota? Who here mostly grew up in Minnesota? Okay, and raise your hand if that's not true, if you grew up somewhere else. Okay, so it's a pretty good mix here. I know you have students here from all over the country and all over the world. So Minnesota is one of only 11 states that has, and has had for 40 years, same-day election registration. If you live in most other states, those 39 others, there's a pre-election day cutoff for registration. Some of you have either lived there, or you visited there, or you know people who live there. So if you're not registered by October 5th, October 10th, October 15th, whatever, some cutoff, that's it. You're out of luck. You are not voting on election day. Doesn't matter what your excuse is. Not so in Minnesota. In Minnesota, you can roll out of bed that day, the day of the election, and you can go to your polling place, register there, and vote there on the same day. So I mean that. I also mean other laws on the books that are more recent. Like now, as of 2 years ago, we have online voter registration. Online voter registration. You can go to mnvotes.org, that's the website, mnvotes.org, and you can register online. In most cases, it takes 2 or 3 minutes. That's it. You don't have to go to some government office anymore. You don't even have to put pen to paper anymore. You can just do it online. Third thing I would highlight, I'm not going to go through a big long list, but this is the third and final one I'll highlight, which I'm particularly proud of because in my last term in the legislature, I had a hand in this one, and that is something that we're calling no excuses absentee voting. The old rule in Minnesota, you may know this from family or friends or others, the old rule, and by old I mean pre-2014, the old rule was if you wanted to vote with an absentee ballot in Minnesota, you needed to sign an oath under penalty of perjury. This is like serious business. Promising and pledging that you were either super sick or you knew you were going to be out of town that day on the election. Well, what was happening was there was a good bit of kind of white lying going on. Anyone here from Edina? Okay, I'm going to pick on Edina, okay? Which is fair because they're one of my high school rivals, as this guy knows, right? So, in Edina in 2008, over 25% of voters there voted absentee. The normal is like high single digits, low double digits. But in Edina that year, strangely, over a quarter voted absentee. There's no way you can convince me that they were all on a business trip that day. No way. What was probably happening was really good people trying to do a really good thing, or maybe telling a white lie. Maybe they thought, maybe I'll be out of town, maybe not, but I'm not sure. I'll check that box anyway. So I say we in the legislature decided, why are we doing this? Why are we making lawbreakers out of moms and dads and ordinary people who just want to vote? So we said, why do we even need this excuse? Just vote because you want to vote absentee. So now you can go to mnvotes.org. You can order an absentee ballot to your home, to your dorm room, to your apartment, to wherever, and you can vote on your own timetable anytime 46 days before the election. 46. That means September 23rd, less than 3 weeks from now, 2.5 weeks, whatever. You can start voting in Minnesota by absentee, and you don't need an excuse anymore. Just say, I want to because I want to, and order it. My dad is 82 years old. He's got Parkinson's disease. He doesn't drive anymore. He uses a walker. And in 2014, the first time it was available, he used this no excuses absentee voting, and he voted from home on his own timetable, voted from his couch. And he loved the freedom and the flexibility of being able to do that. He even claims that he voted for me. I'll never know for sure because it's a secret ballot. He says he did. The point is, it's not just for 82-year-olds with Parkinson's disease. It could be for a busy college student, for example. It could be a busy parent carting kids around to a million activities. It could be for someone who works in an industry, whether it's construction or sales or something else, where they don't know from week to week, am I going to be in town or out of town? I don't know. I'll hedge my bets and vote absentee. So prong number one, in terms of initiatives, is just emphasizing to people, like I'm doing now, hey, go to mnvotes.org, either register online and or order an absentee ballot. You don't have to deal with the polling place hassle if you think it's a hassle the day of the election. Do it beforehand. Prong number 2 has to do with other initiatives that aren't legislative. And let me just focus in particular on our youngest voters or would-be voters, you. Because that's an area where we could stand some improvement, not just in Minnesota, but elsewhere. So even though Minnesota is tops in the nation most years, you may not know this, 2 years ago in 2014, guess what the percentage of 18 to 24-year-olds who were eligible to vote in Minnesota that voted in 2014? Now, it's a non-presidential election year when turnout is usually a good bit lower than a year like this with presidential. What do you think the percentage of 18 to 24-year-olds in Minnesota who voted? Any guesses? 22. 17. Or you're both close. The answer was about 20%. That's really low compared to somewhere in the 50s for the rest of us. And in presidential years, it's in the mid-70s for the rest of us. And it's about 50% for that same age group. So lagging behind. So what do we do about you guys, frankly? Or not so much you. I know everyone in this room is going to vote, of course. I have the utmost confidence that you all will. But those other people that you know that are your age that don't, what do we do about that? Well, part of getting those good habits started early is starting in high school. So we're doing something that has never been done in Minnesota before this year. It's the first ever statewide mock election for high school students. Only for high school kids, only for this one office, President of the United States, not for a county commissioner or state senator or anything else. And here's the way it works. We're providing the ballots. We're providing the little I voted stickers that you wear on your lapel, the red stickers that you wear on election day. And then at the end of the process, we are going to have the schools give us their results, and we're going to post them just like we do on game day, probably 1 week before the real election, so November 1st, because the election's November 8th. And we're going to do it with charts and maps and graphs on our website so that kids in Hopkins can see how kids in Edina or Bemidji or Bloomington or Thief River Falls or wherever have voted. That's never been done before. So we've already got 270 plus high schools signed up. That's the majority of high schools. It's the first time we've ever even tried this. Our initial goal was, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could get 100 schools, get to triple digits? We're already at 270 and more are signing up every week. So we think that's going to be great. Another thing we're doing at the college level, and you're going to see this fall, is we're doing something that we're calling Ballot Bowl 2016. This is something that's never been done in Minnesota. It's been tried in other states. It's basically a competition between and among college campuses to register people to vote. So you and your student government have been and will be involved in that. It'll be 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges and universities, public, private, doesn't matter, all over Minnesota. So I've been in contact with a lot of folks from a lot of schools, and we've got a lot of participation and buy-in, and it will be an attempt to, again, get good habits started early because, all the studies and all the evidence shows that if somebody votes that first time that they're eligible, which I assume includes most of you, that could be an 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old. If you vote that first time, you are far more likely to make that a lifelong habit than if you first vote when you're 30, or 32, or 34, or 40. And so getting those good habits started early is really, really important. And I have to say, this year of all years, with these two presidential candidates who inspire strong feelings, I think the job, I hope, is going to be a little easier this year because of that. So that's just focusing on that one slice of the pie, which is younger voters. I could go on about other things, but you probably have other questions.
Well, actually, I was going to open it up to you guys. If any of you have any questions, Mr. Simon said a lot of things during that part, so if you have questions, raise your hand. Peter will run past the camera with the microphone.
Hi, my name is Riley. First of all, thank you so much for speaking. My question is regarding how we as college students, and also I guess just citizens in general, can be the most informed about all the candidates, other than just like what we hear from the media and that kind of thing. Like, what is the best way to get the best information on the candidates?
That is a great question. By the way, do you mind, and for those of you who ask questions, do you mind just telling me where you're from? I'm always interested.
I'm from Hastings.
From Hastings. Okay, great. Thanks. So where can you get the best information? Well, it's kind of information overload, right? I mean, the great Google machine allows us all to just be inundated, really, right, with information. We have a feature on the website, mnvotes.org. Again, I sound like if I sound like I'm promoting it a lot, it's because I am. If you go to mnvotes.org, we have a feature on there where you can, two features that I think are relevant. One is you click on a feature called My Ballot. if you're wondering, like, I don't know, I live in wherever you live, sure, I know about presidency of the United States. I don't know, am I voting for county commissioner this year, or is there a state senate race? I don't even know what or who is on my ballot. Type in your address and it'll show you what's on your ballot. And from there, and from elsewhere, but certainly from there, there's a place where you can click on links for the candidate's own website. So at least you can see the candidates in their own words. Now, of course, the candidates in their own words are going to be brilliant and wonderful, right? But still, it's a way to filter out some of the other stuff. You know, in terms of voting guides in general, I think there's some, I'm speaking in terms of Minnesota here now, there's some media outlets that do a really good job. Like, I think in terms of the way it's structured, personally, I think the Star Tribune online and on paper voting guide is really useful. So for 10 years when I ran for the legislature, they asked me to fill it out, and I did. And what I like about it is there's space in there for all the sort of usual stuff, you know, name and education and civic activities and resume kind of stuff. But then what I like about the way the Star Tribune does it is they ask you, I don't know what it is, 10 or a dozen questions. And as you all know, just from life, sometimes it's more nuanced than yes, no. You know, do you support X legislation? Well, I want to explain myself. I don't want to just, I want to say yes, but, or no, but. They allow you to do that in this sense. In some areas there's a narrative portion, but in other areas you can sort of do gradations, like it'll say strongly yes, somewhat yes, strongly no, somewhat no, you know, undecided or something like that. So there's nuance there. It's not this gotcha kind of thing. So I like theirs. You can get the candidates in their own words from our website. Hard to make any more specific recommendations than that. The one thing I would say, to flip your question around though, sometimes I get people, I know this was not your question, but sometimes I get the question of, you know, what do I do? Some people even use the word intimidate or intimidated. They say, I feel intimidated. Sure, I'm a living, breathing American. I can't escape coverage of the presidential race. I formed an opinion about the presidential race. I haven't formed an opinion about the county commissioner race or the city council race or whatever. Should I even vote? You know, I feel I'm not informed because sure, I know about president, but I don't know about these other 8 races. I have a strong view on that, which is you should still vote. Even if you don't feel comfortable voting for those other races, you should not let that deter you from voting on the races that you do understand. There is no shame or harm in my book, and others disagree with me, in going in, voting for President of the United States, and leaving. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying, as between that and not voting at all, because you don't know the county commissioner candidates, I mean, no one in this room can say with a straight face that it doesn't matter whether Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or Gary Johnson or Jill Stein or anyone else get elected president. No one can say that with a straight face. Maybe in other areas you can say, 6 of one, half dozen of another. These are such vivid contrasts and vivid contrasting vision. I mean, no one can say that with a straight face. That, it doesn't matter. Things are going to be the same, whoever gets elected. That has never been less true than a year like this. So I would say go and vote. And if that means that you vote only for 3 of the 8 races on the ballot, you know, I hope you vote for them all, but, you know, I'm realistic. You might not feel right about it, or you might not feel motivated enough. So my strong opinion is go in and vote on the ones that you feel comfortable voting on, and don't be talked out of voting just because you don't know in-depth analysis on the Soil and Water Commissioner race or something like that.
Thank you. You have another question? Looks like, and then I have 2 more.
The question I have is twofold. Information is required to really make a good decision on voting. Your website and the governor's website I look at constantly, but also I use the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Christian Science Monitor. One other resource I find that is independent, doesn't reflect what's going on in the newspapers throughout the United States, is the British press. They have a separate section that identifies what's going on in the United States and Canada. And there's a lot of information that comes out of there that is not shown here. I find that through an analysis, you can make a good decision personally by knowing what's going on, and then studying the history of the people that are running for whatever office, what they've accomplished. because we've got a great, I've been around the world many times, worked in Southeast Asia, Europe, South Africa, and find that our freedoms are the greatest in the world. And I appreciate that if I have a chance to just, I got some questions afterward, I would appreciate if you could have time.
Yeah. I'll hang out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. Either you.
My name is Mukadeen Boer from New Jersey, and I'm one of the senators in charge of the College Valley Board for St. Ben's St. John's. And I have a question pertaining to students that's not from Minnesota. How do you register? How should I promote students who are from Minnesota to register to vote? And how do they go through that process?
Great question, and I get this a lot. About what do you do if you come from someplace else? Or what if you are here and want to register back home, either in New Jersey or another state? Let's take the first one first. Well, no, let's take the second. I'm not an expert on other states' election law, but I would urge people who want to vote in their home state, if it's not Minnesota, to vote there. If you really care deeply about that for whatever reason, you should check out that state's voting laws. In most states, not all, the Secretary of State's office, like my office, it would be in charge of that. But that's not the case in every state. But it should be pretty easy to find out where. In Minnesota, which I can speak to, the rule is pretty simple. It's where you consider home. And that doesn't mean necessarily your driver's license. So I'll just use you as an example, not knowing the actual details, but if you still have a New Jersey driver's license or state ID card, that doesn't mean you can't register to vote in Minnesota. It does mean you got to pick one. You can't vote in both states, obviously. That's a felony. But you can register here. So someone from New Jersey or Delaware or California or wherever any of you might be from, you can register here. The residency requirement is very simple in Minnesota under our Constitution, which is it's just 30 days. That's it in Minnesota. So, and there's plenty of time before the election for that. So if you resided in Minnesota and you meet our residency requirements, which is the durational requirement, you're a U.S. citizen, you're 18 years of age, you are not currently serving a felony sentence, that's it. And so you can vote in Minnesota, and it doesn't matter where you're from, but you got to pick. You can't say, this is home and the other place is home. So just tell folks to go to mnvotes.org, and all of that is spelled out there. If it's not, you can call our office, and people can walk any caller through on an individual basis and jump through those hoops and hurdles.
We have a few more questions. You guys should all write down mnvotes.org as well.
I'm Nick Swanson. I'm from the Wayzata Plymouth area. And my question is, there's been a lot of talk about voter security and whether our votes are secure when we actually vote. And with the 2014 constitutional amendment failing, how would you characterize our voting system as being safe and secure, and whether a voting ID system would improve or really maybe disenfranchise some people?
Sure. Well, let me make sure. Great question. There are a couple different ways to go with that. When you say safe and secure and the recent stories, are you referring to some of the sort of alleged hacking and things like that?
Yeah,
Well,
and really controversies around the Frank and Norman collection,
Right.
and how people have been saying maybe some convicts have been
Yes.
voting and that sort of thing.
Right. Okay. Great question. So election integrity. Let me take one part of it first, which is this bit about like cybersecurity and the technical part of it. I've been fielding a lot of questions and doing a lot of talking recently about that because of the national headlines. Alleged hacking by Russia of the Democratic National Committee, alleged hacking also by Russia of 2 state voter databases, Illinois and Arizona recently. We just got an FBI warning about that in our office that has been made public. Other states got that warning too. I feel very good about where we are in Minnesota from a technical standpoint. One of the reasons I feel very good is Minnesota is a paper-based state. Those of you from here who were voted or know about our voting here, we still vote with good old-fashioned paper. There's an irony there, isn't there? I mean, in this high-tech era, paper is kind of our savior. So we didn't kind of get distracted by the shiny object in Minnesota like some states did 10 or 15 years ago where they went all digital or touch screen or all the rest. We don't do that. If you know about Minnesota voting, it's still good old-fashioned paper. You are marking with a pen, and then you're feeding it, yes, into a machine. But even that machine, the polling place that you feed it into, may not, must not, shall not, under state law, be connected to the internet or in any way connected electronically during the whole duration of the voting. Then at the end of the voting, it spits out a paper receipt. And then those paper ballots have to be kept for nearly 2 years under state law. So if someone alleges after the election that Russia or China or any individual went in the system, hacked the system, added a 0 or 2 or 3 to someone's vote total, or subtracted a 0 or 2 or 3 from someone's vote total, we got the actual ballots. We can check it out. So, and even the way that counties on election night communicate their vote totals to us in our office, in the Office of Secretary of State, that is through an encrypted system, which means that anyone hacking it would find gibberish and it would have to be unscrambled. So while no system is completely hack-proof and foolproof, we feel very good about what we're doing. I've spent, since I've been in office, a year and a half, a lot of time and energy and money trying to make our system as safe as possible. In fact, right now, we're working with an outside private security firm just to double check our work, to do a top to bottom kind of security audit. We think we're safe, and we think we have good systems in place, but you know, sometimes it's good to get a fresh set of ears and eyes. So we're spending the money and the time working with this private outside security consultant to try to poke holes. And we await their results and their recommendations, which we will implement, if any, are called for before the election. So on the technical side, we feel good. You're also talking about another dimension that came up in the Franklin-Coleman recount, and that is the business of voter fraud. In that 2008 election, there's a nonpartisan group in Minnesota called the Center for Election Integrity that did a report. It's still on their website. And that 2008 election, they went to all 87 counties and tried to compile information on the prosecutable instances of voter irregularities, people who committed a felony by wrongly registering and or voting. And they came up with 38 instances. Now, that's 38 too many. I don't want to kind of wipe that away or diminish it in the sense that that's 38 more than it should be. It should be 0. But I think we need to put it in some perspective. We have a state of 5.3 million people. 38 of 5.3 million, that's a pretty good number. And no system is going to be completely perfect, but the simple reality is that in Minnesota, it is exceedingly rare that we have that kind of misbehavior. And the irony is, because I was part of this voter ID fight in 2012, the constitutional amendment, the irony was that the photo ID proposal that the voters rejected here would not even have addressed that kind of election irregularity. 38 out of 38, 100%, in other words, of those cases were felons who improperly registered and or voted. In most cases, they believed falsely that they were eligible, and they weren't. But photo ID would not have solved that problem, because even felons have driver's licenses. So the irony is, after all of this, even the proposed solution would not have solved the problem. And it is a problem that is small. We want it to be 0. 38 is 38 too many. But I mean, the analogy that I used then and I use now when it comes to voting, because it's so important, is it's kind of like every doctor and every nurse every day has to make a decision about whether a proposed cure is worse than the disease. And you know, you don't amputate a hand because of mosquito bites. And similarly, you don't risk shutting out tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of voters to get at 38 people. I couldn't abide that. That's why I opposed that constitutional amendment, and that's why I guess it went down at the polls. So we always have to be vigilant, but we shouldn't adopt systems or policies, I guess, that have the effect of shutting out many more people as cases of irregularities that they would fix or find.
Thanks. One just follow-up question on that. You just mentioned that it could be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people get disenfranchised in their votes with that proposed amendment. How would that have come about?
Yes, that's a very fair question. So now I'm getting sort of flashbacks to 2012 because these were the arguments back then. Some of you may remember or follow it. So here's how. What was on the ballot in Minnesota in 2012 would have made Minnesota probably the most restrictive state in the country. And that's not an exaggeration. So I'll give you some examples. Some of them are very pertinent to you as students. what went on the ballot in Minnesota in 2012 would have said that the ID has to be a government-issued photo ID. In many other states, Florida, Louisiana, many other states, their standard was a government-approved photo ID. Meaning, if you went to St. John's or St. Ben's, it's not a government-issued ID, but if the government said, no, we have confidence in the vetting and the screening and the quality of what they're doing at St. John's and St. Ben's, we're going to approve this as an ID you can use at the polls, student ID. That wasn't in the Minnesota law. It said government-issued photo ID, which means if you're a student here, you're out. If you're a student at the U of M, come on in. Your ID is just fine. So that's just one of the many ways it would have disenfranchised people. And the fact is that, in some communities, a surprisingly high percentage of people don't have the requisite photo ID. So I think my judgment about what happened in 2012 is it sort of collapsed of its own weight. It was too extreme. It was too harsh. Another example is, unlike some other states, Mississippi, for example. Mississippi has an explicit exception for people in nursing homes, an explicit exception to photo ID for people in assisted living or in trauma units or other things. We didn't have that in Minnesota. So that's why I say the version that was on the ballot in Minnesota was, I think, too harsh. And I think voters agreed with that. So it would have shut out, in my judgment, too many people without justification.
A few more questions?
Hi, my name is Violet. Thank you for being here. My topic, I moved here about a year ago from Chicago, so you know. My topic is related to that with disenfranchisement, and I'm not sure if this is too much of a partisan issue for you to address, but I wanted to talk about restoring the vote to felons, people who have been convicted of felonies and have served their time and get out of prison and are free citizens and are no longer allowed to vote and to have a voice in our system. I just wanted to see if you had any opinions about that.
I do have opinions about that. Great question, very timely question. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with this issue. It's an increasingly hot topic. First, by way of explanation. So the states in this country fall into roughly 4 categories. Let's say over on this end, there are 2 states, Vermont and Maine. Anyone here from Vermont or Maine? Okay, in Vermont or Maine, you literally never lose your right to vote. You could be an axe murderer serving 11 consecutive life sentences and you can vote from prison. So felony status, at least, does not impact your right to vote. Never lose it. Vote from prison. The next grouping of states, like further along the continuum, are states like Minnesota, where, next state along the continuum are states like North Dakota, I should say, where they have a bright line rule. And the bright line rule is if you're in prison, you can't vote. But the minute you step out of prison, you can vote. Even if you're still serving parts of your sentence that are not the prison part. It's called on paper. That's kind of the lingo. So even if you're still on paper, like, yeah, I'm out of prison, but I still got a couple of years of probation or a couple of years of supervised release, in North Dakota, you can vote. It's a bright line rule. Next grouping of states, Minnesota belongs to this grouping, are the states that say you only get your right to vote back if your entire sentence is done. The prison part and the on-paper part, the probation, the work release, the whatever it is. And then finally, there's a group of states on the other end of the continuum, many of which are in the Deep South, for example, where you either never get your right back to vote for certain or most felonies, or practically speaking, you never do because it's a political hot potato or it requires the governor to do something. So there's a movement, a strong movement, a growing movement, to move Minnesota from its current category to the North Dakota category. Bright line rule, you're in prison, no, you can't vote. But if you serve your time and you're out, and someone's made the judgment that you can be out, that you're not a safety risk, you're paying taxes, you're trying to earn a living, you're trying to put your life back together, you've done your time, that you can vote. And I think that increasingly makes a lot of sense. And there's a big push, a very bipartisan push. You've got liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans united on this issue increasingly, saying, yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense from the standpoint of fairness, and they argue it makes sense from the standpoint of just administrative ease. It's a bright line. Unless you've got like an escapee in front of you, at the polling place, it's pretty simple. If you're there, standing there, and you're otherwise eligible, because you are 18, a citizen, a resident, etc., then you can vote. And I think increasingly, more and more people think that's the right thing to do, and there's a real momentum behind that idea of the legislature. So I expect that sooner rather than later, Minnesota's going to move in that direction.
Just to follow up to that, had that bright line been instituted in the 38 cases you were talking about earlier, would those have been wiped out, or would there still have been?
My understanding of the 38 cases is they were every one of those 38 were cases of people who were out of prison, but still serving their sentence, and who in many cases mistakenly believed, falsely, but mistakenly believed, oh yeah, I'm out of prison, so I can vote. They then registered and or voted and committed a felony by doing so. So my understanding is that most, if not all of those 38 would have been wiped out, because by definition, if they were out of prison, they would have been eligible to vote.
We have another question.
A quick question. If a student is being deployed temporarily to another country, China, UK, how can they arrange to get their vote in before they leave, or while they're there?
That is a great question. The question was, what about a student or anyone else for that matter that is temporarily living somewhere, particularly abroad, and how can they get their ballot in? Well, I mean, there's a whole category of voters like this in federal law. It can be military folks, it can be students studying abroad, it could be diplomats, missionaries, business people who are Minnesotans but are living elsewhere temporarily. And we have a fix for that. One is just the regular old absentee ballot process. So if you know you're going to be overseas in advance or out of Minnesota, you can go to MN Votes and order that absentee ballot. But we also have a procedure under federal law that allows people in that category to at least receive their ballot. Let's say they're studying abroad in London, or they work for 3M and they're stationed in Singapore for a year or something. That person can have their ballot transmitted to them, if they choose, by fax or email. That cuts down on the postage time. Now, we don't yet have the law in the books that allows them to do it on the way back, to return their ballot by email or fax, and there's some reasons for that. I think we ought to explore that. I pushed for it last legislative session. The reason I pushed for it is the rule in Minnesota is you've got to get your ballot, your absentee ballot, back by election day, not postmarked by. It's got to be there. It's got to land there on election day. And depending on where in the world you are and under what circumstances, I mean that the Honeywell employee in London might more easily be able to get her ballot back than might the person in the infantry who's in Afghanistan, for all the obvious reasons. And so the more we can do to help folks get that ballot back more quickly and not roll the dice on whatever mail system they're working on, whether it's military or not, I think is good. So the short answer to your question is vote absentee, order an absentee ballot if necessary, and if you fall into a category of being an overseas or military voter, get it to you quickly by means of electronic transmission, and then try to get it back as soon as you can by mail.
We have another question.
I don't need the microphone, I can just yell. My name is Christine, I'm from River Falls, Wisconsin. I have a quick question about which state to vote in. So I caucused last spring in Minnesota. Does that mean I have to vote in Minnesota, or can I still vote in Wisconsin?
The question, I'll repeat it just in case.
Yeah.
The question was, if someone is not from Minnesota originally, but caucused this last March 1st in Minnesota, does that mean you're committed to voting in Minnesota? No, it doesn't mean you're committed to voting in Minnesota. You can still choose. Again, you got to make one choice. Both places can't be considered home. Don't get in trouble. But you can vote in either place.
Thank you.
All right, that's actually kind of a nice lead-in question for one that I had for you.
Okay.
Minnesota recently announced that in 2020 we will be switching from a caucus to a primary system for presidential elections. What's the reasoning behind this, and how will that help turn out?
Okay. Let me first answer the question by asking one of all of you. How many of you participated in precinct caucuses this year, either as a participant or you just showed up, even if you, oh wow, a lot, okay. It's more than I would have expected. So you know, I'm guessing, that there was a big crowd this year, probably for the reasons that I was saying. People feel very strongly this year. So a lot of people showed up. And in a way, the caucuses this year were a victim of their own success. So many people came that the crowd, depending on where you live, tended to overwhelm the ability of volunteers, and that's what they are, volunteers to basically run an election. You had hundreds of thousands of people show up on caucus night, voting on pieces of scratch paper, and it's not a real election. It's not run with election judges and professionals and government at all, really. And the thought there was that, you know, it's unfair to expect these volunteers to be able to handle the crush of people that show up, particularly in presidential election years. Not to mention the fact, and this was another motivating factor, you know, with a caucus, because it's not a real official election, there is no absentee ballot period. If you have kids and can't get a babysitter that night, if you're in the military, if your job takes you away, if you've got an assignment the next day and you just can't make it, that's your one and only avenue of participation. You can't do it by absentee. And the thought was that particularly in a year like this, or really any year, when people want to have their voices heard but can't, that maybe that's a little less fair for this one office. So what the legislature did, and I supported this legislation, is came up with, I think, a really unique hybrid approach, which is to say for this one office and one office only, that tends to create so much excitement and is only once every 4 years. For this one office only, we're going to go to a real election run by real county and city election people, just like any other election, with real election judges who get paid and trained and all the rest, and have more on-ramps for participation for a lot more people. For that one election and one contest only every 4 years, we're going to a primary, a real election. But for everything else, we're keeping the caucuses. So if you like caucuses for other reasons, to discuss platform issues, to endorse candidates for state legislature or statewide offices, if you like the community town hall feel, you're still going to get to do that for governor, for auditor, for secretary of state, for legislator, for anything else. But for that one contest only, and only every 4 years, we're going to go to a real election. I kind of like that hybrid approach, and it's good. So the thinking there was more on-ramps for participation, relieve a little bit of the pressure on volunteers to conduct and expect them to conduct sort of a quasi-real election. And so that was the thinking. And you know, some people don't like that we're moving in that direction, but I think it's going to work out well as long as we adapt in ways that make sense for county elections administrators. You know, so this is my third stop today. My first two stops of the day were with county elections administrators, and some of them have some worries about what an election in February and March might mean in terms of recruiting election judges, in terms of polling places, in terms of a lot of other things. So we got to work those kinks out over the next 3 years. But I predict in the end, in 2020, presidential contest, we're going to have a ton of participation. People who otherwise might not show up to that high school gym or that church or wherever it is on a caucus night will show up to vote absentee or to vote on election day, and will vote absentee as well. So that's kind of my view of it.
Awesome. Do we have any more questions?
Hi, my name is Maddie. I'm from Andover, but I have a lot of friends from other countries. And my question is in regards to clearly everything that happens at state and local level still affects international students on our campus, but clearly they cannot vote. So what advice do you have for those students as to how they can still be involved in the elections?
Yeah, I get that question too. You're right. For ineligible voters, you can still be involved in the system, as by, for example, getting involved with one of the campaigns. So if some of your international student friends want to be volunteers for or be involved in a political campaign, whether it's the Trump, Clinton, Johnson, Stein campaign, or a local campaign for the legislature or Congress or whatever, I strongly encourage them to do that. They would be welcome with open arms. A body is a body. A phone caller or a door knocker is just that, regardless of where they come from. So that's one way. Or be involved in campus debates or discussions or forums like this one. They can't vote, as you say, but they can do everything but, really. And I would urge them to do that if they have a strong opinion.
I have a question. Yeah. All right, so some other states, I think Colorado's one, they do voting by mail. And I've also heard talks about like online voting. Yeah, I've heard some of that going around. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that will be implemented?
Well, let me start with the first one. So there are 3 states now. Colorado is the most recent, but Oregon and Washington as well, where there are no polling places. They have abolished polling places. They only vote by mail. That's it. It's fascinating. And I don't think we're ready to do that here in Minnesota, and I wouldn't encourage it right now, because I like our sort of hybrid system. You know, technically, if every single person in Minnesota who was eligible to vote or wanted to vote decided to vote by absentee ballot, we would sort of de facto be a vote by mail state. So we have it as an option. I like having a menu of options. So if you want to vote from home and vote by mail, you can do that now. Go to mnvotes.org, like I said, order an absentee ballot, vote from your couch. If though, like most people still, you kind of like the election day feel of going to a polling place and the excitement and whatever reason, then do that as well. So I wouldn't be in favor now of some sort of one-size-fits-all, let's get rid of polling places, especially because we have a mail option. But it's an interesting experiment that they've undertaken. In terms of online voting, I just have to tell you, we are not ready for online voting. We have online voter registration, but that's totally different. 32 states now have that, including Minnesota. But online voting, actually voting with the click of a mouse, I got to tell you, for all the security and concerns that you might imagine, I just don't see us being in a position to do that, or anyone being in a position to do that anytime soon. But with this sort of footnote, and the footnote is, you know, while I don't feel that that's a secure way to vote right now, who knows what technological advancement is going to come our way in the next few years that might make our current concerns seem quaint, right? I mean, think about it. 10 years ago, there were no iPhones or smartphones. The first one came out in 2007. So 10 years ago, we didn't even know what a smartphone was. And yesterday, they released the iPhone 7, right? And we think of it as just this part of life. So my point is, right now, I would say absolutely not. But what if in 3 years there's some sort of breakthrough? So theoretically, could I say that it could never work? No, it might be interesting if we could guarantee absolute security all the time, which we can't now. But theoretically, I mean, it would be something worth looking at if we make the technological strides. And who knows, we just might.
All right, one thing that you mentioned there, you can register online. So my question sort of follows the registration aspect of that. How does registering to vote differ from registering with a party?
Great question. Minnesota does not have party registration. Some of you might come from states where you register as a Democrat or register as a Republican or independent or unaffiliated or whatever. We don't have that, and I don't think ever is a strong word, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. There's been a bipartisan lack of an appetite for that, people signing on the dotted line, declaring a party preference. It's not something we do. But as I understand it to work in those other states, it's exactly that. You're asked to state a preference. The preference can even be that you have no preference, like unaffiliated, but you have to sign somewhere when you register to vote. In Minnesota, you can register and nobody cares what your party preference is. It's not asked, and you're not required to say, and I kind of like that. Because increasingly, people aren't one thing or another. They split their tickets, or they don't think of themselves or want to think of themselves as being in any particular box. And so that's good. So in other states, that's part of registration. It just isn't in Minnesota, and I don't think it will be for a long, long time.
Well, thank you for coming. If anyone else has any other questions, I'm sure Mr. Steinman will stick around
absolutely.
here.
Yeah.
So let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.